Howdy, I'm Jammer. Well, here we are. We're at it again. And I dressed up for the occasion. I even managed to break out my tweed blazer, the one that has the elbow patches on the bottom of it, because today I'm kind of really excited. In fact, I sat here for like 10 minutes trying to just get all my thoughts together as I prepared to get started on this because, as you can see, we are in the presence of Apollo, otherwise known to the Romans as Apollo, which is its kind of own sort of testament about Roman ingenuity. Anyway, today I'm breaking out my statue of Apollo because we're going to focus primarily upon the arts and media, as per usual, specifically the medium of comics, to which case a regular viewer will go, duh. But today we're doing something that I've been talking about a lot, which is that I'm finally going to sit down and just start the series in which I'll just go chapter by chapter and talk about understanding comics, how it's operating, some of the ideas contained therein, because I've said it once, I've said it twice, I've said it a million times already, but you cannot be, in my opinion, an appreciator of the medium of comics without at least sometimes sitting down to read this book. It's too important not to. Now again, your life is your own, read whatever book you want, but if you want to study comics as well as enjoy them, or even if you just want to enjoy them and get a more sort of deeper understanding, or at the very least find an excellent way to defend yourself from people who think that comics aren't an intellectual medium, this book is for you. Now, just a little bit of background. This is one of these books that I never really would have come across if it hadn't been for my local comic book shop, Ground Zero Comics. I went there pretty regularly because the new 52 was coming out. I went in to grab my Batman, my Swamp Thing, my Justice League, what have you. I didn't pick up Dead Man. I really wish I had. Anyway, the owner of the store, or the co-owner of the store, told me that there was a guy who was starting up a graphic novel book club. That sounded really interesting, not to mention the only book club that I would actually see myself attending. So I showed up to a couple meetings, then I got married, and then I didn't show up for close to about a year. Well, the club continued in my absence, and then finally when I moved back to my hometown of Tyler for, I moved back to Tyler, and when I did, I went back to the shop, and sure enough, the book club was still going. And we talked a lot about this book, or at least the store owner did, and my friend TJ did, and it just kept going and going and going, and so finally I was like, you know what, forget it, I'm going to pick up a copy of this book. So I went to the shop, I grabbed a copy of Understanding Comics, and I started to read it. And holy cow, I was not prepared for how incredible this book was going to be. Because it's not just the fact that this book is really well written or really well structured. I have never had a nonfiction book that explores a certain topic so succinctly and so interestingly and so good. Like, this book is really, really, really good. And I would recommend it to anybody without any hesitation. Because even if you've never read a comic a day in your life, this book is really approachable. Now, the book itself is exactly what the topic or the title suggests. It's Understanding Comics. Specifically, it is a comic book, a graphic novel about comics, how they work, what is their history, what is the structure of comics, what are some various tools that comic makers and comic creators and comic fans will know and understand. It's basically just a breakdown of the medium of comics. And this is, again, why I feel that if you're going to talk about comics or study comics or read comics on a regular basis, this book can be a real help to you because it can give you tools and terminology to throw back at somebody who says that comics is an inferior medium, but then also it just gives you a way to start a conversation. So, with that in hand, like I said, I'm going to go chapter by chapter by chapter because there's so much in this book that trying to cover all of it in one little video is just impossible. So I'm going to pick a couple selections from this book to show you and show you exactly why I think this book is just so bloody amazing. Okay, so I've talked a little bit now about what is understanding comics, why do I think it's important, and how I eventually found it. Now, I think it is also important, again, as always, to emphasize like what my personal bias is and why I'm this absolutely bonkers about comics. The reason is pretty simple. My mom taught me how to read using comics. And I might have mentioned it before, but I'll just keep mentioning it again because it's something I'm actually rather proud of. But when I was a kid, Mom had several books around the house. They were gifts to her from my dad when they met and fell in love in college. And they were Calvin and Hobbes. Now, this isn't the original book. That one still belongs to my mom because I made sure she kept her copy. But I went out and bought a copy of this one. It's the first collection of daily comic strips produced by Bill Watterson. And I still distinctly remember her reading all the wacky stories from this book, whether it was Spaceman Spiff, whether it was the dinosaur stories, whether it was Calvin and Hobbes eating camp food and getting hot dogs on fire, what have you. This was a great way for me to read, and because she showed me how to read comics, I was then able to take the books myself, move on to Something Under the Bed is Drooling, Yukon Ho, Weirdos from Outer Space, Scientific Progress Goes Boink, what have you. Calvin and Hobbes actually laid the foundation for how comics worked, and it was also filled with a lot of philosophy, which gave me plenty of things to think about. Now, looking at understanding comics, there's kind of an interesting kind of correlation, at least between me and Scott McCloud, because he begins the book here on this first page talking about, specifically as a kid, why he thought comics weren't really all that interesting. He thought they were just dumb little magazine-type books filled with superheroes who did stupid, what have you. But then he talks about when he was in the 8th grade, a friend of his loaned him some X-Men comic books, and he just absolutely fell in love. But, as he so beautifully illustrates here, as he tried to explain his passion to other people, he couldn't even get off the ground before people began to go, comics? That's ridiculous and silly. But, nevertheless, this is an attitude that still persists, and I can't tell you how many times I'll listen to people say, comic book. No. I want my child, or I prefer to read real books. And the reason for this is simple. The history of comics, or at least the history of what most people assume to be comics, is a history that's still very undervalued and underappreciated. Comics are, for most people, either fun little strips that you read in the newspaper, or else it's superhero comic books. And so, immediately in the first chapter, Scott McCloud sets about trying to understand, okay, what are comics? Because as he shows, and God, this beautiful illustration here, there's a phenomenal number of comics, comic strips, comic creators, comic characters, what have you, that have existed over the last decade, over the last century, and in fact, over the last millennia. And so it's important to understand what exactly is comics, and how can we understand it? Well, he originally uses a term known as sequential art, and he gets that from this author here, Will Eisner's Comics and Sequential Art. Will Eisner is a writer, Apollo, who was chiefly responsible for this strip here, The Spirit. Now, this was, technically speaking, also a newspaper strip for a while, but what was unique about The Spirit was that Will Eisner did things with the form that nobody had really seen before, whether it be perspectives, panel layouts. He would have a tendency to alter the shape of text. Again, automatopoeia, the little sounds like bonks, pows, zooms, zaps, all that stuff. Will Eisner played with that in a way that most comic artists really weren't doing. And so he eventually published the graphic novel A Contract with God, which I actually have over there, and I'll show it when I take a pause here in a second. But that graphic novel was really instrumental in trying to establish comics as a legitimate medium. Now, Will Eisner said sequential art. But what's really great about one of the opening passages of Understanding Comics, is he shows you, yes, you can, technically speaking, use that definition. Again, we have that gentleman with a top hat. Hat is on one panel, hat is off in the second panel. So in this way, this is sequential art. But, as he so effectively demonstrates, that kind of can be a very limiting factor, because sequential art just means art in sequence. So, art, 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 art. And as he demonstrates here, you can, technically speaking, look at film as a sequential mode of art, because all of film is millions of pictures arranged together in a specific way, but then put through a projector, which then moves all those images together, creating the sensation that these images are moving. So you could ultimately argue that panel by panel by panel by panel, a film could be a comic book. And that's not the only thing that he makes an argument for here. Looking at just the history of sequential art, at least in that frame of mind, there's plenty of examples through history. Now, if you've ever taken a world history course, you've probably heard of the Battle of Hastings. It took place in 1066, and there's a long history. I've actually got a paperback book over here on my shelf called 1066, which goes into the sort of intricate background of TLDR. What happened was the region of Normandy in North France was owned by a group of nobles, one of whom, by the name, was William. And William thought he should be the King of England. But there was already a King of England, so he invaded, and he won the battle. That is a really short version of the Battle of Hastings. Ask a historian, go to Wikipedia, it's a really interesting story. Anyway, after he established power, the Normans established what is today known as the Bayeux Tapestry, and all it is a long tapestry that shows the invasion of Normandy. It'll show various sequences of the battle. It'll show the Normans arriving on the shores of England. It shows Harold, the loser of the battle, actually taking an arrow to the eye. So what this tapestry is it's more or less a piece of political propaganda. But Scott McCloud points it out is because you have sequential images starting in one side of the tapestry, and as the eye moves further on, you get different sequences. It may not be divided necessarily panel by panel, but it is sequential art arranged in a specific way. Now, I keep using sequential art, but excuse me, my speech impediment, as always. Anyway, sequential art at first seems like an effective definition, but whenever you're talking about an artistic conversation or a philosophic conversation, you sometimes have to use jargon. If you've never heard of jargon, what it is it's just industry-specific language. You've probably heard the expression at some point, legalese. That means really fancy lawyer talk. There's a lot of key terms that lawyers will use in court of law. Same thing goes for engineers. Same thing goes for mathematicians, for scientists, for scholars of literature. Every field of academics and arts, artistic analysis, has some manner of jargon. That's just really a fancy pants word for fancy words, fancy languages, and each of these has a definition. So, in understanding comics, Scott McCloud legitimizes comics by coming up with a solid definition that the reader can use to understand what a comic is. And there's actually a fun little sequence where he's standing in front of a room full of comic characters coming up and offering a lot of different suggestions. And finally they come to this conclusion right here, which is that it is juxtaposed pictorial and other images in a deliberate sequence. That is a damn mouthful. But it works for what we're looking at. Again, juxtaposed, pictorial, and other images in a deliberate sequence. Again, we go to the Battle of Hastings. We have juxtaposed pictorial images in a deliberate sequence. We go to this man on the back of the book. He has his top hat on. He has his top hat off. Juxtaposed pictorial images in a deliberate sequence. And he goes on to provide further examples in the book, specifically looking at Egyptian art. Now, if you're a kid like me, you probably grew up watching that Brendan Fraser Mummy movie. And oh my gosh, I was such a nerd for that movie. And I just fell in love with Egypt and Egyptology. And so naturally, when he threw this argument out, I was in for it. But as he points out, there are several depictions on the walls of Egyptian tombs, and at first it may seem that these rows are their own separate images, and they're supposed to be different and abstract. But in fact, these temples are designed to be read, as he demonstrates right down here in this box, in a deliberate sequence. So the eye literally moves left to right and all the way up. And so again, we see here that Scott McCloud is attempting to demonstrate that comics is a lot older than a lot of people take it for. Because most people who really haven't embraced the medium or spent a lot of time reading it assume that comics have been around as long as newspapers or been around as long as comic books, which really only gives it a time period of about 50 to 60 years. This argument argues for a longer study, or at least a much longer period of operation for the medium of comics. Because as long as human beings have been arranging images next to each other in a specific sequence, they've effectively been making a form of comics. Now, immediately, somebody's going to argue with it, and I'm sure they will, and they have every right to. But what I would tell them is just listen to the argument, because he goes on to provide more examples. Specifically, he discusses the work of several Enlightenment-era Europeans who would do basically parodies of social manners and masquerades, what have you, and by using images in a deliberate sequence, whether they realized it or not, they were more or less making comics. And then he provides a different example in the case of Max Ernst, who created a kind of surreal novel in the little book titled A Week of Kindness. And as he shows you here, it may not at first seem like a comic book, because each of these little squares are ultimately individual pages in a comic book. And again, a whole page may not seem like juxtaposed pictorial images. But like I showed you with the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, just because a panel takes an entire page doesn't mean it's not juxtaposed pictorial images in a deliberate sequence. So this definition, I would argue, is really fundamental, because it not only argues for comics being a medium that is a lot older than we would traditionally think it is, it argues that human beings have been making comics and using the medium whether they recognize it or not. And that is a really profound argument, because it ultimately forces us to make the question of, one, are comics as old as we think, or are they a lot older? And then two, if they are a lot older, and some of these older artworks are actually potentially in a different medium than what we're accustomed to, that might force us to ask new questions about how we interpret those arts, how we classify those arts, and then whether or not this medium that we've largely been ignoring and throwing in the dumpster is maybe actually important in terms of the human conversation. All right, so we've talked about... We've talked now a little bit about the medium, what have you. I also need to kind of re-emphasize this, because even if I am repeating myself, it really does beg the question. Beside me, you'll see there's a massive stack of comic books. I've been spending that stimulus check on comics. I'm not sorry for any of it. Now you'll see, or you might be able to recognize a couple of covers. Again, when we talk about art, we have certain expectations. Most people think of art, and they immediately think of characters like Picasso, Joan Moreau, Francis Bacon, Georgia O'Keeffe. Artists that are still culturally relevant, artists that are supreme talents, and artists that do need to be talked about. But at the same time they need to be talked about, we also need to understand why we're talking about them, because who gets to determine what art is and what art isn't is a big part of this book. Because to a casual person on the street, a painting in a museum is art. But then if we say, took this copy of Green Lantern by Grant Morrison and opened it up to some, say, random page, we might at first think, okay, yeah, we've got a bunch of sci-fi creatures and we're floating in space and they've got magic rings and stuff, but is that art? art? Again, it comes down to how we want to understand art. And since this is my channel, how do I understand art? And I need to be careful because I am in the presence of Apollo. But ultimately, art for me is expression. It is expression of wants, desires, longings, dreams, aspirations, joys, sorrows, angers. Basically, the sum locus of the human experience is art. And it's really regardless of whatever format it comes in. Yes, this copy of Green Lantern has magic rings and space battles and aliens, but it is ultimately an expression, and if you're willing to give it time, you'll see the artistic merit in it. Or, I talked about this one a second ago, if you look at A Contract with God by our man Will Eisner, if you look at what he's doing, he's discussing the sorrows and the sadness which can be experienced by human beings. But he's doing it, for example, here, in a visual way by using juxtaposed pictorial images in a deliberate sequence. Now, what does this have to do with understanding comics? Arguably, one of the most important passages of Chapter 1 is this sequence right here. And I'm going to go ahead and pause your screen for a moment so that you can actually read it. I'll give you 5 seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, you paused it, you read it. And hey, before anything else happens, stop and think about the fact that you read something. Good for you. But if you look at that passage, I think it's absolutely everything. It's easy to mistake the message for the messenger. It's easy to mistake the content for the medium. And this is something I talked a little bit about in the previous video when I discussed Mad Max. Yes, that Mad Max Vertigo title. You might hear a rumbling in the back. My cat's rubbing against the door. Yes, that Mad Max book is probably nowhere near as artistically significant as, say, Watchmen or A Contract with God. But there again, it's easy to dismiss that book because it's a comic book rather than, say, a movie or a painting or a sculpture. With a book like Understanding Comics, there is a constant and, more importantly, dedicated intellectual argument being made. And that last point is important because, as he points out in this very last 2 pages here, there's so much potential in terms of art. Because, as he demonstrates, if you look at, say, the content of books, it can be Dada, horror, surrealism, historical fiction, folktales, erotica, mystery, religious topics, stream of consciousness, satire. And I can tell you, just based upon my big-ass library filled with books, most of them comics, that I have a book that fits every one of those criteria. The thing that unites them is the medium. And so, what he's trying to show here is there has been a misperception that because comics is a different medium, it's automatically disqualified. But anybody who's taken the time to even just read one story from A Contract with God will tell you that that is a false assumption. This book has a true artistic element to it. And even a book like The Spirit, which is largely a superhero book, has important messages to make. It just also helps that the medium is absolutely gorgeous. So, looking at this first chapter of Understanding Comics, really, hopefully, what you see here is that he is, on the one hand, making what's known as an apology. And if you've ever heard of a phrase like Christian apologist, it's an expression for sometimes what would happen in like the early ancient period when Christianity was just developing. It would be writers and philosophers basically arguing for the merits of the church and the Christian philosophy. The first chapter, I think you can make an argument, is it's somewhat comics apology. But it's past that. It's in fact comics defense, and it's using the medium to make the argument that, hey, there's art here. In fact, I'm going to make art for you. I'm going to make damn good art, and hopefully by the end you're going to see that it's possible to make damn good art. This is the reason why I love Scott McCloud. Like me, he is a nerd. But, unlike me, he is extraordinarily coherent. He has an impressive amount of conviction, And most importantly, he is able to use the medium in really interesting ways to show its power. So that's chapter 1 of a book that has somewhere around, I believe, 11 chapters. Hold on, let me see. Well, actually, 9 chapters. Okay, so we're through chapter 1. There should be about 8 more videos about this book. And I'm going to let you know now, I have no idea if the second video is going to come immediately after this. Because as you can see, I bought a big stack of comics. And I actually just finished 2 comics the other day. And I actually just finished Sean Murphy's Batman White Knight. So I might hop into that one. I don't know. As always, just stay tuned to the channel. As soon as I get these things loaded up, I'll make sure to post them on the channel. And as always, too, please, as always, like, share, subscribe, all that jazz. It helps me know that you're interested. And it also, gives me the validation that I need. Also, as always, please feel free, add comments in the description section below. Tell me what comics you're reading. Even if it's not ones that you think you want me to review, just, you want to talk comics. Talk to me. I would love to talk comics with anybody and everybody. I love this stuff, if it hasn't already been made apparent. But, in conclusion, I hope you're enjoying these videos, and thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it immensely. I think you're so cool, and thanks again. Go read some comics.